All right, guys. So Elon Musk was asked about Twitter's terms of service and free speech on the platform, and he gave a really interesting answer, and also, as you're about to see, a kind of contradictory answer. So I'm going to show you the video. I mean, the headline is obvious. He says we should bring back Donald Trump on Twitter. But then take note of the other things that he says here, which it's not getting as much traction, but it actually is sort of a deviation from things he said previously about free speech on social media. So let's listen.
Are you planning to let Donald Trump back on?
Well, I think there's a general question of should Twitter have permanent bans? And, you know, I've talked with Jack Dorsey about this, and he and I are of the same mind, which is that permanent bans should be extremely rare and really reserved for people where they're trying to, for accounts that are bots or spam scam accounts.
Yeah, so on that point, I largely agree. I would also say that if there are instances of laws actually being broken, like if you post a murder video, if you post a CP video, if you do direct threats of violence or like incitement and it's repeated and it's purposeful, maybe then you have a conversation about a lifetime ban. But I agree that lifetime bans should be super duper rare, and we need to lean much more on the side of free speech than we currently do, because now, obviously they censor and deplatform and things of that nature for what seems like offenses that are weaker and weaker as time goes by. So Musk and Dorsey are kind of on the same page.
Where there's just no legitimacy to the account at all. I do think that it was not correct to ban Donald Trump. I think that was a mistake because it alienated a large part of the country and did not ultimately result in Donald Trump not having a voice. He is now going to be on Truth Social.
Now, it did actually reduce the amount his voice gets out there. I think it's a misnomer that in every instance, if you crack down on free speech or you deplatform, that, well, it doesn't work because then these people find other avenues to get their voice out. And so it doesn't even have the intended effect of like, let's lessen the impact of this person's voice. In the case of Trump, there is an argument that maybe that happened. But, I certainly see stuff about Trump significantly less than I did previously. And one of the main reasons is he's not in the prime place where he made news, which is Twitter. There are instances of deplatforming and banning working in the sense that it sort of does silence a voice. Like, think of like Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, or think of Alex Jones. Like, yeah, maybe they're on some alternative platforms, but their reach is nowhere near as far and wide as it was. Now, that's a separate question, though, from whether or not the banning and the deplatforming should be happening, because, my argument, as you guys know, is that as a general rule, as a matter of principle, you shouldn't do it. So I'm not sure if that part of what he's saying here is true. I agree that Trump shouldn't have been banned, or if he was going to be banned, it should have been for, a shorter amount of time, because, just think about it objectively. Like, the argument is, well, he egged people on to do the insurrection or the riot at the Capitol, so that's like a big enough offense where he should be banned permanently. But Taliban leaders are still on Twitter, and not only did they egg on a takeover of a government, they actively did take over a government in Afghanistan. Like, they overthrew a government. So if you're using that same logic, and by the way, Trump didn't do that on Twitter. It wasn't on Twitter. It's something that he did off Twitter, and then the question arises, well, can you ban people from Twitter for stuff they do off Twitter? If you can, then why wouldn't you ban somebody who's like a murderer, who then eventually serves their term and gets out of prison, but they still murdered somebody? Why would murdering somebody not get you a lifetime ban, but, the speech Trump gave where he sort of egged his followers on to go to January 6th does get you a ban? It's just there's no consistency. And so it doesn't make sense. So I agree that Trump shouldn't have been banned. If you were going to ban Trump for anything, it should have been during the North Korea beef when, Trump basically was like, look, I got bigger weapons than you. and we're a stronger country than you, and maybe I'll bomb you. Like, if you were going to ban him for anything, that was a time when you had more of an argument to do it, because that's almost a direct threat of violence. But then at the same time, there's, in the Twitter terms of service, they carve out an exemption when it comes to direct threats of violence for states, for like governments. So they're allowed to do it, but regular people aren't allowed to do it. Now that exemption, that exemption probably shouldn't exist. You should have the rules be, equal across the board. But I mean, maybe there were things here and there that he could have been banned for some period of time. But certainly a lifetime ban doesn't make sense, and it's a political thing that they did. By definition, it's political. And, a lot of, like, a bunch of European leaders have come out and said, this is not, like, this truly is a threat. You can't have the social media companies with this much power that they can ban the sitting president of the United States. So AMLO, who's a leftist leader in Mexico, he came out against the ban. A bunch of European leaders came out against the ban. So they're going to try to frame Musk's position here as like an extremist position, but I really don't think it's an extreme position. I think the extreme position is permanently banning what was the sitting president of the United States. So let's see what else he says.
As will a large part of the sort of the right in the United States, and so I think this could end up being, frankly, worse than having a single forum where everyone can debate. I guess the answer is that I would reverse the perma ban. Obviously, I don't own Twitter yet, so this is not like a thing that will definitely happen, because what if I don't own Twitter? But my opinion, and Jack Dorsey, I want to be clear, shares this opinion, is that we should not have perma bans. Now that doesn't mean that somebody gets to say whatever they want to say. If they say something that is illegal or otherwise, just destructive to the world, then there should be perhaps a timeout.
Okay, see, that's interesting to me, because on the illegal point, I think that's fair. Everybody understands that even though if you believe in free speech, you still believe in the very limited rules that there are. You can't do direct threats of violence, libel, slander, etc. But if you say something that's quote-unquote destructive to the world, then they'll ban you? Well, what does that mean? What's the definition of destructive to the world? What are the standards for that? Because what, a Ted Cruz supporter thinks is destructive to the world is not what I think is destructive to the world. In fact, we have totally different conceptions of what is destructive to the world. Elon Musk thinks, Tesla unionizing is destructive to the world. So would he ban a Tesla union account? I'm asking questions here because when you leave the terms vague, that's where it's open to interpretation, and that's where you get this tsunami of bans and deplatforming and shadow banning, and then wait for it, he's going to say something interesting about shadow banning.
A temporary suspension or that particular tweet should be made invisible or have very limited traction.
Elon Musk just endorsed shadow banning on Twitter. That tweet should be made invisible or have limited traction. I think was he referring to the thing that is quote-unquote destructive to the world? That's in the eye of the beholder, and that's debatable as to what is and isn't destructive to the world. The political right thinks everything the left does and says is destructive to the world. The political left thinks everything the right does and says is destructive to the world. But he just endorsed, in principle, shadow banning. Making tweets invisible or giving them limited traction on purpose because of the content of the tweet. Elon, it's hard for me not to say it. Meet the same boss, same as the old boss. See, this is why, look, I hate to pat myself on the back, except I don't hate to pat myself on the back, but I said this day one when we learned that, he made the moves to buy Twitter. I don't know why everybody's so sure about what he's going to do. Everybody seemed to have these hardcore ideas of Elon's going to do X, Y, and Z. And, some of the things he said, but obviously, when crafting social media regulatory policies for the company, it's so much more complex and nuanced than anybody can give credit for in a single conversation. So my position was, look, I just want to wait and see what he does. And then now we're getting more and more information about what he plans to do. And even though I think he would deviate in some key ways from old Twitter management, which, by the way, I think I would probably agree with the ways in which he would deviate. There's still a lot of nooks and crannies and gray area that he's going to have to iron out, and it looks to me like in those gray areas, he's going to sort of default to business as usual. You know, shadow banning shouldn't even really be a thing, but he just endorsed shadow banning. So, look, in some ways, honestly, I think he's just a little confused about what to do. And he hasn't really fleshed out his thoughts on it in a way beyond the slogans of, like, I support free speech. Okay, but if you support free speech, then you can't ban things that are quote-unquote destructive to the world, because that's part of free speech, is people saying destructive things or potentially destructive things. And shadow banning is certainly not endorsing free speech. Let's see what else he says.
But I think perma-bans just fundamentally undermine trust in Twitter as a town square where everyone can voice their opinion.
Now, I just want to say, since we last talked about this issue of Elon buying Twitter, we got news that he brought on a whole bunch of other investors with him. Some financial institutions, and also, like, the government of Qatar gave money as well. So they're sort of like, you know, buying Twitter with Elon to some extent. And as soon as I saw that list of investors, I was like, oh boy, here we go. Here we go. Because those people are going to have a voice now too. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't want the government of Qatar determining what we are and aren't allowed to say. So, in some ways, meet the new boss same as the old boss. There are key differences, and we'll see how it gets implemented over time, but I think it's going to be 85% the same as it is now. Let's keep watching.
It was I think it was a morally bad decision, to be clear, and foolish in the extreme.
Even after he egged on the crowd who went to the US Capitol, some of them carrying nooses, you still think it was a mistake to remove him?
He didn't do that on Twitter. Let's be clear. He did not do that on Twitter. He gave a speech, and in the speech, he said something that is going to be investigated, and maybe they will determine it's incitement. We'll find out. But he said, we're going to go to the Capitol, and we got to be strong when we're at the Capitol. We got to be strong. We're going to cheer on some people, and maybe others we're not going to cheer on so much. And then later on, when the shit hit the fan, maybe like an hour and a half or 2 hours into it, he finally came out and spoke when people were prodding him to go out and speak to kind of calm everything down, and he spoke out of both sides of his mouth. You guys should go home. You guys should go home. This has gone too far, but also I understand why you're mad, and this election was stolen, and we can't let it stand. So he spoke out of both sides of his mouth, but none of this was on Twitter. And so he was banned for something he didn't do on Twitter, which that they don't do that for anybody else.
I think if there are tweets that are wrong, they should, and bad, those should be either deleted or made invisible.
Okay, that flies in the face of everything you've been saying for months. If tweets are wrong and bad, they should be taken down or made invisible? What is wrong and what is bad? I hate to get all philosophical on you, but these are the actual conversations that need to be happening. What is wrong and what is bad? Who determines that? And just the fact that you would agree that there's some sort of entity that should be in a position to determine that means you're very, very similar to the previous owners of Twitter. Very similar. That was the goofiest part of all. I'm all for free speech unless this stuff is wrong and bad. But that's the whole conversation we have every time anyway. People say, oh, this is wrong and this is bad. And others say, no, it's not. And some people say, I think if they're principled, hey, even if it's wrong and bad, you gotta let it be. Only if it like violates the law should you have some sort of process to maybe take the stuff down. But he's endorsed shadow banning. He said if it's wrong or bad or destructive to the world, it can be pulled or made invisible. This really isn't that much different. The key way in which it is different is, hey, there was a mistake to ban Trump in the first place. Dorsey agrees with that. European governments agree with that. The Mexican president agrees with that. Some big free speech groups. I think even the ACLU disagreed with that. So that's not that. I agree with Musk on that, but that's not. If that's like the only change you're talking about here, and maybe limiting permanent bans. Those are two good changes, but in the other ways, he sounds very similar. And we don't know, by the way, like people who are convinced that you let Trump back on Twitter and it will definitely help his electoral viability. I'm not convinced about that. I think that could go either way. It is possible that it helps him, but it also is possible that everybody gets reminded that the guy who's a psychopath is a psychopath. You know, more reminding people in a very upfront way and direct way that if Trump's back on Twitter, hey, this is why you guys like voted him out. Well, that might hurt him. So we don't know how it'll impact it. So you got to make the decision based off of principle. And on the principle, I agree with Elon. But again, in other ways, he seems to very clearly agree with the previous Twitter rules, which is surprising to many people.
And a suspension, a temporary suspension is appropriate, but not a permanent ban.
So if the deal completes, he might potentially come back on, but with the understanding that if he does something similar again, he'll be back in the sin bin.
He has publicly stated that he will not be coming back to Twitter, and that he will only be on Truth Social. And this is the point that I'm trying to make, which is perhaps not getting across, is that banning Trump from Twitter didn't end Trump's voice. It will amplify it among the right. And this is why it is morally wrong. And
I don't know if that's true. Again, he's certainly less visible now than he was. Certainly less visible now than he was. The argument of deplatforming or censoring doesn't work. I think all the recent evidence actually maybe cuts against that slightly. It's still debatable, but, you know, Milo, gone. Alex Jones, much less of an impact on the national discourse. Trump, significantly less impact. So then the question is just on principle, should you ban people for X, Y, or Z? And 90% of the time I'm going to say don't ban. And very rare instances where a law is actually broken, then, you know, you can ban. But again, I think my big answer to this, and you guys know this, is that you should regulate Twitter like a public utility. So you should expand First Amendment protections. You should officially codify it as like the new public square. I think that's the real answer. Having an owner who's more on the side of free speech is good, but that's not a real solution. There's not like a good billionaire is going to come save us. No, you just need to get the power away from the billionaires and regulate it like a public utility. But you guys have heard my spiel on that a million times. Anyway, look, this is the last part I want to show you, which is really something because I think this was the most controversial thing he said. Look at this. Like I said, my preference is to hew close to the laws of countries in which Twitter operates. If the citizens want something banned, then pass a law to do so. Otherwise, it should be allowed. Okay, hold on. He talks about free speech all the time and how he supports free speech on Twitter. Here he says, no, I want Twitter to match the laws of the countries in which Twitter operates. That is definitely not a free speech stance. You want to know how I know that? Because there are authoritarian governments all over the world that don't even pay lip service to the idea of freedom of speech or free expression. You know, the Chinese government bans anything that they don't like. Saudi Arabia bans anything they don't like. Qatar bans anything they don't like, and they just invested with Elon and Twitter. Now, I just named some relatively authoritarian governments with the ones I just listed. In the EU, they have tough speech laws. They have strict speech laws. It's not like it is in the US. We're unique in our, you know, even just verbally supporting the idea of free speech. We're unique in that respect. They don't have a sort of free speech fetishism in those countries. And so there are all sorts of hate speech laws. In fact, the European Union came out and warned Elon Musk, like, hey, you better censor and ban if you're going to have Twitter here, son. And if you don't do proper content moderation, then you're outski. Like, we'll get rid of Twitter here in Europe. So this is not a free speech position. If you say, yes, I will acquiesce to whatever the government say, well, what's Israel going to say, for example, when there are, you know, some maybe prominent Palestinian accounts, pro-Palestinian human rights accounts and free Palestine accounts on Twitter? They're going to go to Elon Musk and say, yeah, you could operate here, but you got to ban that account. Or you got to, you know, shadow ban that account in all of Israel. Are you going to do it? So you're just going to listen to what the government say or what the laws of the country say? Well, we have restrictive speech laws all around the world. So this is fundamentally contradictory to the notion of let's have Twitter as a free speech platform. If you have it mirror the laws around the world, it will definitely not be a free speech platform. So, no, the idea, if you really wanted to embrace free speech, you can embrace it and then tell all these countries, look, here are our terms. These are the rules on Twitter. If you don't like the rules on Twitter, then Twitter won't operate in your country. But if you have Twitter in your country, these are the rules. You're going to not censor people based on their content or political views. You're not going to have oversensitive, draconian speech crackdowns. And he's flipping it here. He's saying, we will abide by that. We will abide by whatever the laws are, whatever the government say. No, that's a terrible idea. So anyway, look, it's hard to not conclude this. He's just confused. Like, he hasn't thought this through as much as he thinks he's thought it through. And it shows pretty clearly. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.